looked at metaphysical poetry tradition. Tradition. So how to look at the YouTube and name. New classical. It's neoclassical. Neoclassical. Neoclassical tradition. Now, the neoclassical period in English history in English history began from 1660 to 1785. In other words, you can say that the 18th century marks the neoclassical period in English history. The term neoclassical simply means like the classical. Simply means like the classical. And it means that the writers and the intellectuals of this time look to the classical period, that is the period of the Greeks and the Romans. The writers of this time look to the classical period. When I say the classical period, I mean the period of the Greeks and the Romans for inspiration. They look to the classical writers for inspiration. They modeled their work after the writers of the Greeks and the Roman times. They thought that if they imitated neoclassical writers in the 18th century English history, thought that if they imitated writers like Homer, Virgil, that their work would be great, just like those works of ancient writers were great. So that is the character of literature in the neoclassical period. They wanted to look like the classical writers. They wanted to be like the classical writers. So this attribute of copying from the classical writers cut across the major genres of literature at the time, including poetry especially. This attribute, this tendency to imitate Roman and Greek writers by the 18th century writers in English history cuts across the three genres of literature, or the major genres of literature at the time, especially poetry, which was a major genre. Specifically, the major poetic genre practiced, specifically the major poetic genre practiced at this time was the mock epic. Was the what? The mock epic. Or you can call it the mock heroic epic. The mock epic or the mock heroic epic. If you're asked to discuss neoclassical poetry, what should come to your mind is what? The mock epic or the mock heroic epic. Heroic is spelled Heroic, heroic epic. All right? Because the writers of this time went back to borrow the epic form from the Greek and Roman writers. And then they modified it so that it was not necessarily the epic, it became the mock epic. They took the original form from the Greek and Roman writers, and the original form is the epic, a long narrative poem that has a solemn tone, that has dignity of style, used to praise heroic deeds. That's the definition of the epic. Now they borrowed it and then modified it so that we cannot call it the epic, we rather call it the mock epic. And so what is the mock epic? We must have talked about the mock epic when we were doing types of poetry. And you should recall that the mock epic refers to a type of poetry that has all the qualities of the epic, except that it treats trivial subject matter. So the mock epic is like the epic in style, but it treats what? Trivial subject matter, unserious subject matter. And so to use the epic style to say something that is not suitable to the style results in laughter, results in satire, a work of art that mocks human weaknesses. All right? A work of art that ridicules human weaknesses in order to correct them. So a good example of a mock epic poem written in the neoclassical period, a good example of the mock epic poem, written in the neoclassical period is The Rape of the Lock by Alexander Pope. Is The Rape of the Lock by Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock is a good example of mock epic poetry. So the mock epic was very lengthy and was written in dignified language. The only difference from the epic is that it treated unserious, trivial subject matter, which results in satire, a work of art that ridicules human weaknesses, makes us to laugh at our faults in order to correct them. Now, the mock epic is usually written in what is called heroic couplets. The mock epic is usually written in what is called heroic couplets. The mock epic is usually written in heroic couplet. The stanza structure of the mock epic is heroic couplet. And what is a couplet? A couplet is a two-line stanza poem. Couplet is a poem that has two stanzas, or a stanza of two lines. Sorry, a poem that has two lines. A poem that has two-line stanza. All right, is a couplet. Or a stanza that's made up of two lines is a couplet. But when you say heroic couplet, this is how you define it. This is how you define the heroic couplet. Heroic couplet is made up of two lines that rhyme, and are written in iambic pentameter. Two lines that rhyme and written in iambic pentameter. Okay, somebody asks you, what is heroic couplet? You tell the person that heroic couplet is used to describe, a term used to describe a two-line stanza that has a rhyme scheme and is written in iambic pentameter. Okay. So we then move on to the Romantic poetry tradition. Romantic poetry tradition. The ideology that is embodied in the Romantic poetry tradition is Romanticism. The ideology that is embodied in the Romantic poetry tradition is Romanticism. Romanticism. The Romantic period followed the Neoclassical period and even opposed most of its attributes. In fact, the Neoclassical period and the Romantic period are opposite each other in terms of qualities and attributes. In terms of qualities and attributes, the Romantic period and the Neoclassical period are poles apart. All right? They're opposite each other. Because while the Neoclassical period emphasizes reason, the Romantic period emphasizes emotion, the illogical, the irrational. While the Neoclassical period emphasizes logic, reason, the Romantic period emphasizes feelings, emotions, madness, irrationality, illogicality. While the Neoclassical period values order, the Romantic period values chaos. The Romantic period in English history began in 1798 with the publication of the lyrical ballads. Began in 1798 with the publication of the lyrical ballads. By William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. By William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. We mentioned this name when we were talking about the rhyme of the ancient mariner under an ode. Taylor is spelled Taylor. Coleridge is spelled Coleridge. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth. All right? The romantic notion of poetry is contained in the preface to the lyrical ballads. You know, some books do have preface. The romantic notion of poetry is contained in the preface to the lyrical ballads. By that I mean how we should define romantic poetry. What romantic poetry is all about is contained in the preface to the book, the lyrical ballads, written by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So most critics usually refer to the preface to the lyrical ballads as the romantic manifesto, all right? As a manifesto of romantic poetry. That is something that gives us a book that gives us the definition of how of what romantic poetry should be like. Okay, a book that gives us a set of ideas about romantic poetry. And how we should view romantic poetry is contained in how the romantic writers define poetry. Now, romantic writers define poetry, which is a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. All right? The romantic writers define poetry as what? A spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. I said that the romantic writers view poetry as a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. One of the most important attributes of romantic poetry is that it values nature. It values nature. One of the most important attributes of romantic poetry is that it values nature. Everything in nature is valued by romantic poets. The hills, the rivers, the mountains, the plains, the flowers, winter, the birds, everything in nature is held in high esteem. The tiniest creatures are respected. The tiniest of creatures are respected. Everything in nature is given preference. No one is looked down upon. The romantic writers are predisposed to view the environment as beautiful, to idealize the environment and the things in it. In Romanticism, every creature hitherto looked down upon is highly regarded. So the poetry values nature. It celebrates innocence. Romantic poetry celebrates innocence, celebrates children. Whatever is looked down upon, black people, poor people, are lifted by the romantic poets and exalted. So the ethos of Romanticism came with the French Revolution. The ethos, ethos, of Romanticism came with the French Revolution in 1789. In 1789, when the French people took up arms against their leaders who were insensitive to their needs. So that after the horrors of the French Revolution, the nations of Europe started valuing common people, people that were before now thought to be useless, could not do anything. All right? Because they were so surprised that these same people took up arms and sacked them. So they started valuing them. Even though the revolution did not actually take place in England, the effects could be felt in how reforms were made to accommodate the poor and the common people. So at the end of the day, it was not only the poor or the lowly place that were highly valued, even animals, insects were accorded respect as part of God's creation. As part of God's creation. That's what you need to understand. So a typical romantic poetry would celebrate nature, celebrate innocence, celebrate animals. Nobody is ugly in romantic poetry. The tiger, the python, there's something beautiful about them. Okay? Nature, rivers, the sun, the moon, they're all celebrated. Romantic poetry. And this poetry was characterized by emotion, feelings. So romantic poetry was expressive. Was what? Expressive. Expressive means that it proceeded or it proceeds from the writer's personal experience, from the writer's ability to express his feelings, express himself or herself. Okay? Expressive work of art is how the author feels. The author simply expresses how he or she feels. It was expressive. So it values emotion, feelings. So the typical romantic creative writing process was like this. The poet goes out to nature and then finds something in nature that attracts him, holds him in awe. And then when he comes back home, he recalls that encounter with nature, and with the recollection, he writes it down. A spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. He has to write it down at that moment when the recollection is hot, because when the recollection is done, he might not be able to write it again. So that was how romantic poets were inspired to write, through recalling an encounter with nature. at a particular time during the day or in the previous days. Okay, so I have one romantic poem in this collection. It is called The Sick Rose. It's entitled The Sick Rose. It's just 2 stanzas. We could just read it and see its romantic qualities before we proceed to the next tradition. So if you have your poetic collection, if you have your collection, your anthology, you can look at The Sick Rose and look at The Sick Rose. Sick Rose. The Sick Rose. Do you have it? Have you seen it? The poem is by William Blake, one of the most important romantic poets. Is William Blake. Okay, so may we read it together? One go. O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night, in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. One go. Another time. O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night, in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. Okay? So you notice that the entire poem is one long sentence, rendered in 2 stanzas, but it's one long sentence. It should be read as, O rose, thou art sick, the invisible worm that flies in the night, in the howling storm, has found out thy bed of crimson joy, and his dark secret love does thy life destroy. Okay? So from the title, you could see that the poem has romantic value because it is talking about rose, which is an aspect of nature. Which is an aspect of nature. Which is an aspect of nature. So the rose is flower, and so you could see that the subject matter of this poem fits our description of romantic poetry. The fact that it's really concerned with nature or an aspect of nature. Okay? And another thing you need to notice that rose depicted in this poem, the rose depicted in the poem is ill, is sick. So that means that rose is not only being talked about when it is beautiful and lovely and such a great sight to behold, all right? Remember, the flower rose is normally used to symbolize love, okay, and usually gifted between lovers, among lovers. But in this particular case, this rose is ill, but then it still is seen to be a fit subject for poetry, which is what romantic poetry is all about. No subject matter is looked down upon, all right? And another thing that you need to pay attention to in the poem is that the rose depicted in the poem is personified. Is what? Personified, all right? So one of the major devices in the poem is personification, which is the ascription of human attributes to inanimate things. Okay? Personification is a figure of speech in which human attributes ascribed to inanimate things. Okay? So rose here is personified. You could see that in the first line where the first letter is capitalized. That means you could see that somebody's name, being a proper noun, is usually written in capital A, initial, no matter where it appears in the sentence. So that shows that the rose that we discuss in this poem is not only a flower, but it can refer to an individual, a human being. All right? And so at the end of the day, we are carrying two meanings along in this poem. Rose as flower and rose as a person, right? And so you could carry those two because poetry usually, the meaning in poetry usually exists at various levels, at least two levels. So you could take those two levels as you read the poem to the end. Okay, so the poem basically describes the process that led to the sickness of the rose, that an invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm. So you could see the use of visual imagery. All right, in words like worm, which is described as invisible, in words like night, in words like storm, those are visual, considered visual imagery in the poem. Now, you have kinetic imagery in words like flies, all right? And howling gives us auditory imagery. Howling gives us auditory imagery in the poem, right? Remember that poets operate based on imagery, right? So, the invisible worm that flies in the night in the howling storm. It is this worm that carries the seed of the sickness that is sown in Rose's life, right? Has found out thy bed of crimson joy. That means it could be, okay, let's just note that night celebrates nature. Storm also celebrates nature. Whether the phenomenon in nature is positive or negative, romantic poetry sees positivity in it all the time. Whether it is a storm, hurricane, darkness, it's always celebrated. Okay? So, it is seen that Rose gets sick while lying down on the bed. All right? The expression crimson joy is an instance of oxymoron. Right? Oxymoron. Which is a figure of speech in which two contradictory words are placed side by side in an expression. Crimson and joy is an example of oxymoron. Okay? And his dark secret love does thy life destroy. So the interaction, the romantic interaction between Rose and this invisible worm is what leads to her sickness. Okay? So we move from there. So if you meet any romantic poem, if you come across any romantic poem, you should be able to discuss it, given that you know all the qualities that a romantic poem should have. Some of the odes that we have in this collection are romantic poems. All right? Some of the odes that we have, let's say, Ode to a Nightingale, you can already see the romantic nature of it in the title, Nightingale. All right? So when you read it, you pay attention to the romantic elements in it. All right, so we move on to the next poetry tradition, which is the modernist poetry tradition. 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 That is the penultimate poetry tradition. Because after the modernist poetry tradition, we are going to look at contemporary poetry. Right? Good. So it is after contemporary poetry that we move on to the next topic. So the modern period followed the Victorian period. The modern period followed the Victorian period. The modern period is said to have begun in 1910. The modern period is said to have begun in 1910. And one thing you should remember is that the modernist period is completely different from the ages that went before it. It's a radical age. It's a radical age. All right? It's completely different from the previous ages. In fact, the modern period opposed, or the Romantic period opposes the principles, the ideologies of the previous ages. So it's normally seen as a radical period in human history. Specifically, the Romantic period is, the modern period or the modernist period is opposed to the Romantic period. It's opposed to the Romantic period. It reacted against the principles of Romanticism. The character of the modern age, the character of the character of the modernist period is that it opposed the principles, or it opposes, if you want to use the present, historic present, it opposes the attributes of the Romantic period. The modernist period, the modernist period destabilized traditional beliefs and ideologies. Because it was driven by a pessimistic view of human progress. It was driven by a pessimistic view of human progress. It was driven by a pessimistic view of human progress. One of the major events that informed the modern period was the First World War. Was the First World War. One of the events that informed the modern period, the modernist period, was the what? The First World War, fought between 1914 and 1918. Fought between 1914 and 1918, in which millions of people were killed using sophisticated technology, sophisticated weapons, which was the product of science, scientific achievement and attainment, thought to have predicated the progress of humanity. But the same science helped to produce such dangerous weapons that were used to destroy millions of lives. All right? So, the death of so many people made the people of this time to believe that there was no good and loving creator about the universe. Because a good and loving creature will not sit around and watch so much carnage being perpetrated by humanity, against humanity. All right? So they said there was no God. And so they became pessimistic towards traditional beliefs like religion and belief in the existence of God. Because to them, a good and loving God will intervene and ensure that so much wickedness were not perpetrated in the world. So modernism is marked by pessimism. The modernists were pessimistic in their view of life. In their view of life. People began thinking radically. And at this time, relationships also shifted. Relationships also shifted. At this time, relationships also shifted. Relationship between man and God shifted. All right? Because some people started rejecting the idea that God exists. Relationship between masters and servants shifted because servants rebelled against their masters and wanted more, wanted better conditions. Relationship between men and women shifted because women started fighting for their rights and would not be oppressed anymore. Relationship between the workers and the employers also shifted because the workers wanted more rights. Relationship between the leaders and the subjects also shifted because the people rebelled against their leaders and wanted better leadership and better conditions of life, better living conditions. In the arts, modernism is marked by art for art's sake. In the art, modernism is marked by art for art's sake. It's marked by a terminology known as what? Art for art's sake. Art for art's sake. Art for art's sake. Art for art's sake is a term used to describe the study of aesthetics in literature. Art for art's sake is used to describe the idea that literature should be studied mainly for its aesthetics. Art for art's sake is a term used to describe the idea that literature should be studied mainly for its what? Aesthetics. Its beauty. Its beauty. That means you subject the language of the text to analysis to see how creative, how imaginative, and how beautiful it is. That's art for us. And you do not and you do not use it to infer social situations in society. You not use literature to talk about, to ask for changes in society. You simply concentrate on literature for its own sake and not for any other purpose. In art for art's sake, literature does not play any social function, any political function, but it is studied for its own sake, for its own beauty. All right? Another term that you should note when discussing modernism is the avant-garde. The avant-garde. Another term that you should note when talking about modernism is the avant-garde. The avant-garde. AVANT hyphen GARDE. AVANT hyphen, not dash, hyphen, and then GARDE, the avant-garde. All right? It means it is French for advanced guard. It is French for advanced guard. It is French for advanced guard. GUARD, advanced guard. Avant-garde is French for advanced guard, and it is a term used to describe writers and their works who sought to experiment new ways of representing reality, who sought to experiment with new ways of representing reality. Because modernist literature is marked by experimentation in style. Writers decided to experiment with different techniques, completely different from what used to be obtained in the past. All right? So the avant-garde describes a set of writers who experimented with art and techniques, new art and techniques, new forms, new art forms and new techniques. All right? The avant-garde is used to describe modernist writers for their experimentation in style and forms. This is captured in the phrase by Ezra Pound. This is captured in a phrase by Ezra Pound, and the phrase is make it new. Make it new. Ezra Pound is spelled E-Z-R-A, Pound, P-O-U-N-D. Ezra Pound said, make it new. So that expression, make it new, captures the essence of the avant-garde. All right? Advanced garde, writers who experimented new art forms and style, because this is what modernism is all about. The experiment in literature, modernism is about the experimentation with new art forms and new techniques, new style, doing things differently from what used to be done in the past. All right? So in terms of poetry, a term that describes modernist poetry is imagism. A term that describes modernist poetry is what? Imagism. I-M-A-G-I-S-M. Imagism. Imagism is a 20th century poetry movement. When we say that modernism began in 1910, what century is that? 20th century. You guys are good students, right? Good students of history. 1910. From 1900 is the 20th century. So Imagism is a 20th century poetry movement practiced by Ezra Pound, Amy Lowell, A-M-Y, Lowell, L-O-W-E-L-L, Amy Lowell, and William Carlos, Williams. Carlos is spelled C-A-R-L-O-S. William Carlos Williams. Characterized by a keen depiction and selection of images or imagery in poetry. Characterized by a keen depiction and selection of what? Of images or imagery in poetry. In imagists, the poets who wrote according to this tradition were called imagists. The poets who wrote according to this tradition were called what? Imagists. All right? In imagist poetry, the poem is written to evoke pictures or images in the mind of the reader. In imagism, poetry is consciously written to evoke pictures in the mind of the reader. It is characterized by a direct representation of images. It is characterized by a direct representation of images. It is also characterized by specific diction or word choice. Imagist poetry is also characterized by specific diction or word choice. Specific diction or word choice. Diction means choice of words. It's also characterized by descriptive phrases called epithets. It is also characterized by descriptive phrases called epithets. E-P-I-T-H-E-T-S, epithets. Epithets are descriptive words in literature. They are usually adjectives or adjectivals. Epithets. So in poetry, instead of saying adjective, the writer uses adjectives. You say epithets. A descriptive word in literature is called what? Epithets. So you are likely to come across epithets in imagist poetry. Imagist poetry uses the minimum words. That means the poem was not verbose. The poem was not what? Verbose. The writer did not use unnecessary words. All right? So the poet uses minimum word count. That means the writer counts the words that he or she uses in the poem. So the poem was terse. Was what? Terse. T-E-R-S-E. Was terse. Was even epigrammatic. Was even what? Epigrammatic. Because of the few words used. in the poem. The writer was not verbose, right? verbose, verbose. Not use unnecessary words, using too many words. And the wheelbarrow is depicted as being positioned outside where it is beaten by the rain. All right? And beside it, you have a white chicken. So it wants to paint a picture because it's imagistic poetry. It wants to do what? Paint mental pictures by careful choice of visual imagery. And so when you read the poem, you see with your mind's eyes. All right? So you pay attention to the red wheelbarrow itself is an example of visual imagery. Red itself is an instance of visual imagery because you see. All right? Wheelbarrow itself is visual imagery. So the poem, the major imagery in the poem is visual. Right? Even rainwater is visual. White is visual, visual imagery. Chicken is visual. So the most dominant imagery in the poem is visual imagery. And why? Because the writer wants you to see. If the writer wants you to hear, he will be using more of auditory imagery, words that appeal to your sense of hearing. Okay, now let us go to the shortest of them all. The shortest of them all. And that is a poem entitled In a Station of the Metro. In a Station of the Metro. In a Station of the Metro. In a Station of the Metro by Ezra Pound. By Ezra Pound. In a Station of the Metro. Written by Ezra Pound. Written by Ezra Pound. All right, so the poem. The poem. First line. First line. The apparition. Excuse me. Another modernist poetry that I would like to draw your attention to as we bring the class to a close is The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. It is in the anthology. The poem is in the anthology. So you check the anthology. If you see it, say hi. So it's there, the anthology. Okay? And the poem depicts the pessimism of the persona concerning the times, the modernist period. And the poem says, turning and turning in a widening jar, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loose upon the world. So that depicts the cyclic view of time, by the modern intellectual, so that humanity is not seen as moving to a predetermined destination, but human history rather moves in circles. It's cyclic, all right, and tends to go back to where it started. That is why we are in the modern period, but we are still killing one another, just as it was in the primitive past. So turning and turning in a widening jar. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dim tide is loosed and everywhere. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst is full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out, and a vast image of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a ship with a lion bird in the head of a man. It gets blank and pitiless of the sun, raises slow thighs, while all about it reels shadows of indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, and now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed a nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what raw beasts it are come round at last.